Okay.
Perfect.
All right, so I'm going to be talking about the challenges of multilingualism and language education and Australian perspective, and hopefully there's something of interest to the listeners and viewers in French Polynesia and elsewhere in the world. So very quickly, a potted history for those who don't know. Australia as a continent has been inhabited for at least 50,000 years by Indigenous Australians. European history is much briefer. In 1788, European settlement began with the founding of Port Jackson, which later became Sydney, and that's the start of British colonisation. Not surprisingly, Australia was for a long time extremely British oriented, and we had in operation a so-called White Australia policy, which restricted migration, which strongly favoured migration from the British Isles, etc. And things only really began to change after mass migration from Europe after World War II. However, it was always on the basis of this White Australia policy. The underlying assumption was that it was very Anglo-centric and that everyone would quickly assimilate and speak English only. By the 1970s and 80s, for a whole series of complicated reasons, there was the rise of what we call it multiculturalism, and some official acceptance and general acceptance of some differences and some difference, including the concept of language maintenance, as well as a shift in language education policy. So until this time, you basically learned either French or German or Latin. And until the 60s and 70s, and from the 1980s on, actually, there's been a huge explosion in the number of languages that are taught to children via different mechanisms. Since the 1980s, but especially since the 1990s, there's been a dramatic change in the profile of migration, the type of migration, the sheer volume of migration. And there's at least 300 non-Indigenous languages from around the world spoken in Melbourne, for instance. And in fact, this number is actually a huge underreporting in a paper that I conducted, research that I conducted with Simon Musgrave on the South Sudanese community. The degree of underreporting of languages was quite amazing. All right, so obviously with 50,000 years of settlement, Australia has always been highly multilingual. And here is a map of Indigenous languages in Australia at the time of European settlement. Gives you an idea of how complex it was. It looks like this amazing quilt patchwork. There are, estimates of more than 300 languages. Unfortunately, as a result of contact with European colonists, today only about 10 or 15 are still being transmitted across generations, and only in restricted parts of the country. So basically in the centre and in the north. And this is not surprisingly the due of very negative colonial and post-colonial policies and practices. Today, things have reversed, perhaps often too late. There's some government support in favour of language revitalisation, and public attitudes have also changed, which is a really good thing. So that once upon a time, Aboriginal languages, Indigenous languages were strongly denigrated by the population, and everyone had to shift to English. Attitudes have changed, and I'll come back to that. And many communities are now working, Indigenous communities, on waking or reviving what they call sleeping languages, based on the documentation and memories of members of their communities, etc. So there are significant efforts in different parts of the country in terms of language revival as well. But it's really quite, if you look at this map, it's really quite extraordinary the step. And multilingualism during this time was normal. So people spoke 3 to 4 to 5, 6 languages. That was completely and absolutely normal in this world. Okay, so we have a number of challenges, and I'm curious to know the extent to which you might recognise this in the Francophone world. But these are very typical of the Australian context, and actually, unfortunately, very typical of the wider Anglophone context. So what I'm going to talk about now is, is often being commented upon in New Zealand, Canada, the United States, the United Kingdom, etc. And we have this big problem of what we call the monolingual mindset. And Michael Klein, who was a very famous Australian sociolinguist, he popularised this term in 2005. This was actually originally this was actually a term that was used in German first, and then was translated into English by Michael Klein. And basically, here's a quote from his 2005 book: "The greatest impediment to recognizing, valuing, and utilizing our language potential is a persistent monolingual mindset. And such a mindset sees everything in terms of monolingualism being the norm, even though there are more bi and multilinguals in the world than monolinguals." So to an Australian, to the average Australian, having one language is completely normal, and having a second language is unusual, and having a third is, for a lot of people, not really comprehensible. Okay, and we have what I call the Anglophone paradox, and I am extremely privileged as a native English speaker by the fact that English is undoubtedly the global #1 language in the world. This is a huge privilege to me. We know that lots of studies have been done by Grins and others, showing that there are a whole series of privileges, economic, social, etc., as a result of this. But it also has a downside. It's a terrible blight for those of us who are native speakers of English, for a whole series of reasons. So, for instance, there's a really interesting study in which they surveyed Danish students, and not long ago, and they found that these Danish students did not want English speakers to learn Danish. Danish was for them. They wanted English speakers to only speak English. And of course, one of the benefits to these Danish students is they get the opportunity to use their very proficient English skills. So sometimes in some places there's even a resistance to English speakers taking an interest in their language. But there are other costs to us as well, and one of them is what I call the language cost benefit formula, is totally skewed. And so the cost of linguistic success, everything that comes with it, the economic and social capital that we obtain as first language English speakers, is so low, and the apparent benefit of speaking L1 English is so great, there is really no understanding of the real cost and effort required to achieve the same for a second language, or even to understand what the benefits are of having a second or additional languages. So for an English speaker, they do not understand, because from day one, we are born and raised speaking English, and it seems to be an effortless process. We really do not understand that learning a language involves effort. And that's a huge challenge for us. And it feeds through in a whole series of ways into policy and everything else. So when you combine speaking only English with the monolingual mindset, what do you end up with? And it's what a term that I've coined and I've been trying to popularize. It's what I call the Anglo bubble. It's slightly humorous, but I think that it really is quite accurate. And I define that as that part of the world with a concentration of monolingual English speakers that operates in English, thinks it's only natural and normal that everything should happen in English, and should logically be experienced and understood only in English, and actually finds it hard to believe that things can be experienced in another language or only in another language. And of course, living in this bubble, one of the costs of that is that there is a kind of self-exclusion. We're only aware of what happens in our bubble. I have lots of examples of things that happen outside the Anglo bubble that we have absolutely no idea about, because it's never pierced the skin of the bubble. All right, but this monolingual mindset and the Anglo bubble has a huge effect on language education in Australia. And one of the big consequences is that we have really substantial underinvestment and poor policy about language education, but also about multilingualism in the wider societal setting. It's also very difficult to get the message across that language learning and multilingualism are good for educational outcomes. And note that I've put in English here, and I'll come back to this, but it's also really good for personal development as well as for social well-being, things such as cohesion, inclusion, etc. Often language education, unfortunately, is couched in terms of economic benefits. And so for a number of years now, governments have encouraged us to, some governments, not all governments, have encouraged us to learn a specific number of Asian languages because that's going to make us rich. to the detriment of lots of other languages and lots of other good reasons why we need to learn language. And a huge challenge for us is to address all of these issues in schools through language education promotion, as well as in wider society. So it's somewhat surprising that we have such a big problem and that we have such a monolingual mindset, because actually Australia is hugely multicultural and multilingual. This combination of, we have been able to deal with mass migration in a relatively harmonious way. We're often held up as a casebook example of how you can have large-scale migration with relatively few problems, and the way we've addressed this through formal policies of multiculturalism. And it's absolutely true that the proportion of people born overseas, particularly non-English speaking countries, and who speak a language other than English at home, continues to increase over time. So in Melbourne, it's about, I think about 35% speak a language other than English at home. And we know that there is a lot of underreporting. This is through the official census. There's a lot of underreporting of what actually goes on at home. So the question then becomes, if we have this huge contradiction, this multilingual society, that all of these people coming in speaking additional languages, including my own family, my own parents arrived here speaking their respective languages in the 1950s and 1960s. Where does language education actually fit in? Well, compared to what happens in many parts of Europe, I would say that we're not doing particularly well. And one of the problems is that in general, we have a school system that does not add language, but takes away language. So we have in practice a subtractive model of multilingualism in the school system. That is, that many children turn up at school with an additional language, whatever it might be, as well as English, and very quickly, over a matter of a few years, they become strongly monolingual in English and lose their language skills, their pre-existing language skills, and they they're unlikely to leave school with additional language skills that they may have picked up at school. So at the moment, less than 10% of Australian students leave secondary school with having completed language study in the final 2 years of school. It's a very low percentage. In the 1960s, less than 10% today, in some parts of Australia, less than 5%. In the 1960s, that proportion was 40%. Of students completing school, and the reason being was you needed a language to enter many universities. Once that requirement was removed in the 1960s, there was a collapse. There was a decline in the number of students learning a language all the way through school. Okay, so why isn't language education thriving in Anglophone schools? Well, we don't spend much money at all. And an average student is likely in primary school to have only 40 to 50 minutes of language education a week. In secondary school, depending on where you are in Australia, you may only have 150 hours in total of language tuition in your first 2 years of secondary school. Everything else after that is optional. And there really is not significant resourcing. We also have quite unrealistic expectations about what can be achieved. So we have people who think that their children will leave primary school or secondary school being able to get a job as a banker in Shanghai. And that's clearly not the case. We laugh, and I do take a positive humorous approach to all of this, but this is unfortunately, and of course, when these expectations cannot be met, then we have a negative impact. We have weak policy, inconsistent policy, and a failure to implement policy. And often, unfortunately, it's what happens in the schools that undermine what available policy there is. There's a lot of schools have a lot of autonomy, particularly the school principal who runs the school has a lot of autonomy and has to make decisions. And unfortunately, they're not necessarily in favour of languages, as we'll see, because they have to deal with lots of conflicting pressures in schools. And we'll talk about what they might be. They're just, from a principal's perspective, there's just too much to do. And more generally, having extra language skills is not viewed and utilised as a valued resource. And strangely enough, while we're highly multicultural and highly multilingual, in Australian society, and you go to the large parts of Australia where you'll see many parts of Melbourne, for instance, where I am, where streets are covered in other languages. Weirdly enough, multilingualism is not something that's particularly visible or audible, and this is the critical thing, or desirable to those students who only have one language in their daily experience. It's quite easy to live only in English and ignore all of that, or only pay superficial attention to the multilingual, multicultural nature of Australia. So from the school's perspective, they have to address the two major concerns, and I have to explain them briefly to you here now. They are, first, the crowded curriculum, and the silo effect. There are 8 key learning areas, and all schools are meant to provide English, mathematics, etc. Languages is number 7 or 8, and it often is dropped off. And there's also huge focus and anxiety about literacy and numeracy in English. And we have this NAPLAN testing, which is this national proficiency testing. And this causes huge anxiety. And the introduction of NAPLAN testing has unfortunately shifted the emphasis again on literacy and numeracy in English, and on focusing on English to the detriment of learning and studying other languages. So, but there is a way we can address these as language educators. We can actually talk to schools and explain to them that we can deal with the crowded curriculum and the silo effect, that you can actually teach different learning areas in combination with languages through clear content and language integrated learning. So Zara is a great advocate of this, and I know that a lot of this is happening in the French Polynesia, and we're also making efforts in Australia as well. And the other concern about literacy and numeracy, which is only tested in English, of course, is that these skills are transferable and can be achieved in other languages and improve expected outcomes in English as well. And I'll show you some examples. We also need bigger picture solutions. We really need a clear, positive message, not just in schools, about all the benefits, not just about economic, but it has to be educational, personal, intercultural, social, cognitive, economic, etc. There has to be sustained promotion everywhere. And we need positive images, ideas, and people. And this is one of the challenges. We don't get a lot of positive reinforcement. So here is an example of some good news. Ironically, I can tell them all of these things, but when it appears in a newspaper, such as the Sydney Morning Herald, this kind of thing works. So here we go, NAPLAN testing, all the anxiety about that. And so children who have a language other than English at home actually do better in year 7. In fact, the effect is noted earlier. And this is ignored by many schools, that actually these kids with additional languages or who have exposure to an additional language in the primary school actually do better. So we have to get this message out. And this is slightly more detailed. This is a similar thing. I just want to draw your attention to the last line. This is on NAPLAN testing. Our students in the bilingual class, so these are children who are being taught in Korean, outperformed our non-bilingual students in both literacy and numeracy in English. Okay, so the benefits, they are transferable. And we have a positive message that we can share. So there's also some more good news from with respect to Indigenous languages. There's been a huge explosion, rise in interest in including Indigenous languages in school programs, particularly in primary schools. And this is a huge shift for us. Because this is finally, there's an acceptance and an understanding of the importance of Indigenous language and culture, and it's a way of exposing non-Indigenous communities, non-Indigenous Australians to a completely different perspective of Australia. We also have some new government initiatives. So Early Learning Languages Australia, and if you're interested, please have a look at that. This is quite an interesting, just go to that link. These are apps intended for children who are 3, 4, 5, and 6 years old. You can find them in French, Italian, Japanese, German, Indonesian, Chinese, etc., Turkish, Greek, Hindi, etc. And the idea is to expose preschoolers and early primary students to languages. So it's not necessarily language learning, but it's to expose them to languages with the idea that this will generate an interest in language learning that the government hopes will last all the way through education until they finish their secondary school. So, that's a huge ask. That's a really huge ask, but in an evaluation that I did with teachers for the government a couple of years ago, there was huge interest in this. And as a result of which they moved it out of the preschool system and are now using it in early primary. So are the challenges facing language education unique to Australia? Unfortunately, as I said to you before, it's not specific to Australia, but felt all across the Anglosphere or the Anglo bubble. And I suspect in many other countries as well. And for those of you from the Francosphere, you may have some thoughts about this as well. Despite all the challenges and the problems, we live in hope, and I'm an optimist. I really am. There's a lot of goodwill, notwithstanding all the problems. And there's an understanding, actually, government level that we have to do something. Really the biggest problem is the resourcing and the promotion. But I think but beyond all of that is desire. And if we had huge desire for other languages and language education, then we would really be able to push all of these things along. We don't have to explain to anyone in Europe why learning, or around the world, why learning English is interesting. We know there's huge desire amongst young people to learn English. They want to plug into Anglophone culture, the Anglophone world. We understand that, but it's really desire driven. You don't have to convince people about that. The challenge is for us, really the big challenge is how do we generate it for other languages? So I just want to show you, how to create desire for language. Well, I think, I often show this little clip because it is Italian, and I am, of course, an Italianist. I'm the professor of Italian. So I just want to show you how well the Italians can, in 60 seconds, generate a lot of desire. And I apologize if this doesn't work over Zoom, but I hope it will.
Sì ai sogni, sì alla libertà, sì alla vita, sì al silenzio, sì alla seduzione, sì all'emozione, sì alla follia, sì all'amore, sì a un nuovo inizio, sì alla serenità, sì alla forza, sì a noi due, sì a me stessa, sì il nuovo profumo, Giorgio Armani.
So I often say, I don't know what they're selling, but I know that I want it. Okay, so this is a masterclass in 60 seconds about how you create desire. This single ad, now it's ironic because I don't know if you recognize the actress. She's a very, very famous Australian actress, Kate Blanchett. She's from Melbourne. She speaks French, by the way, so you might think of inviting her along. But ironically, so they're using her, but it's all in Italian. And of course, you don't understand this, the average Australian or English speaker won't understand what it's about, but they want it. And this is desire. This is a fantastic masterclass. And of course, this had huge impact. Sales went through the roof once this ad was shown in Australia. And it's so successful that every few years they show it again. So they rest it and then they bring it out again. But this is an incredible example of what desire is and how you generate it. We just have to find the secret for languages education in Australia. So at that point, I'd just like to say grazie, and I hope that was of interest for you.